Really what we have to do is we have to change the system. We have to make it safe for doctors to get the help that they need.
Welcome to EyeCan, a podcast about ophthalmology through a uniquely Canadian lens with Dr. Sarah Ziai and myself, Dr. Guillermo Rocha.
This season, we have two new co-hosts joining us, Dr. Mona Dagger and Dr. Hadi Saheb. They'll be hosting upcoming episodes throughout the season. Season 3 of the EyeCan podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. Thank you for your support.
Dr. Susan Biali Haas is an award-winning medical doctor, health and wellness expert, coach, speaker, and author. She helps people worldwide to reduce stress, prevent burnout, improve mental health, and live with increased wellness and resilience. Dr. Biali Haas overcame burnout and depression at the beginning of her medical career, quickly becoming an internationally recognized influencer in health and wellness.
With over 2 decades spent studying wellness and resiliency, 20 years of clinical experience with thousands of patients, and more than 10 years coaching high-performance clients worldwide, she expertly applies her experience and skills to equip people to live better lives. She inspires a broad range of clients, from military leaders and senior executives to physicians and other healthcare professionals, to take control of their health and start living more impactful, meaningful lives. Dr. Biali Haas has also provided focused support to patients with mental health challenges, providing virtual medical psychotherapy treatment during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Biali Haas' latest book, The Resilient Life, Manage Stress, Prevent Burnout, and Strengthen Your Mental and Physical Health, was released in fall 2022. Dr. Biali Haas, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
On this episode of EyeCan, we'd like to explore burnout and depression among the medical community. According to a recent report, more than half of physicians reported feeling burnt out this year, and nearly 1 in 4 doctors reported feeling depressed, the highest percentages in 5 years. Susan, you actually have a personal story related to this. You have lived it, you've experienced the feeling of being in a dark place. You were able not just to overcome it, but also to help others who are going through the difficult situations you have overcome.
Yes, of course. I've been telling this story for a really, really long time. And it's been very interesting to experience the wellspring really in interest and challenges with mental health in the era that we're living in. So I feel really grateful actually for what happened to me, even more grateful than ever, because it has proven to be so useful in engaging in the conversation about mental health challenges and the practice of medicine. My experience really began in residency, a little bit towards the end of medical school, but it really got very bad in residency. I was diagnosed with depression at the time and put on medication. But it wasn't until much later, as I became just almost obsessed with understanding big picture mental health, because I really, even though I had basic training in psychiatry as part of my training, I didn't understand it. Even my doctor didn't understand what was fully going on. And so it was a long time later, as I learned about burnout in physicians, that I realized that one of my primary diagnoses for sure was severe burnout. And also I was having trauma-related symptoms that I didn't get treated for many years that were related to the things that I had witnessed in the line of duty. And, we didn't have any debriefings or anything like that. This was all just so secret. Like, my doctor was the only person at the time when I got the diagnosis and was initially going through it. She was the only one who knew what was going on. And it actually really came to a head one night, 2 years into my residency. And I was in a very intense Royal College ER 5-year program. I was in year 2, and I had just finished a 36-hour shift in the cardiac care unit at the ER at VGH, and just like not even a minute of sleep We all know what those nights are like. And it had actually been 36 hours. And I went home to my dark little apartment that I was living in at the time, very lonely life, just work and nothing else. And I let myself in, shut the door behind me, threw my stuff on the ground. I didn't even turn the lights on. And as I lay there, I had no idea how I was going to keep going. And I had not had any counseling support. It hadn't even been suggested. I'm sure that as a resident, I actually probably even had pretty good benefits and access to mental health support, but it hadn't even crossed my mind. And I started to think about quitting the ER, quitting my residency. I started to think about quitting medicine, but I really didn't think that there was anything else that I could do. And I was in all this student debt. And so my thoughts grew even more desperate. And I started to think about actually just quitting the planet, and started to even think of ways in which I might actually be able to do that at that moment. And what just I find so incredible to this day is that at that very moment when my thoughts grew that dark, the phone rang. And it's amazing to me that I even answered it in the state that I was in. And it was one of the chief ER residents. Her name is Karen. And as far as I know, she's actually still working at VGH, but she's an attending now. She's was amazing. One of the few women in the program. And she was calling to check in on me. Even though I had this super tough facade, like there were cracks that were starting to show, and she was watching really closely. There actually had been a resident who had committed suicide very, very recently before I had entered the program. And so they were on alert because of that. And that phone call, it may have saved my life, and it completely changed the entire course of my life. She really encouraged me to take a stress leave. And she said, if you decide that you want to continue with the program, we will totally back you up, and we will make sure that you get out the other side, which I'll never forget that she said that. It was so incredibly supportive. She was amazing. Yes. But then she said something that was completely shocking to me at the time. She said, while you're on your stress leave, I want you to think about like who you actually are, like what talents do you want to use in the world, and what do you actually want your life to be like? And for real, no one in my life, including myself, had ever really asked me that. And so I had all these epiphanies while I was on that stress leave, and I came back. I did resign from the ER residency. I got my license as a GP, and I embarked on this amazing journey that I've been on ever since.
Wow, thanks for sharing this with us. It's very touching, but it's incredible that your whole life, I mean, you've dedicated it to that specific difficulty you had, and you've become such an influencer. It's just incredible what you've contributed just out of this situation.
Yes, and it wasn't anything that I planned. It was like I just had this burning desire to just tell everyone what had happened to me, and to figure out why it had happened, and to prevent as many people as I could from having it happen to them. And at the time, it was really, really unusual for a doctor to be openly talking about this. And I think some of that for me was that I had this vision early on that I wanted to be someone who wrote books and educated people and worked with media. And so that actually became, even though I continued to work as a doctor, that became my grand passion. So I think I was less afraid of, say, losing my license, because there are so many reasons that doctors don't seek help and don't talk about what's going on with them. So I think maybe I was a bit exempt because I had this other vision for my life.
Indeed. So in June 2021, about a year into the COVID pandemic, you spoke to this US membership on stress management, burnout prevention, and human resilience. Since that time, we have sadly seen several deaths by suicide in the medical profession. Can you shed light on this? We are more open now. We talk about it more. Why is it still happening? What are the contributing factors? Is it endemic? Is it an issue that's coming to light because of world events or other professional life challenges? How do we interpret this? More and more numbers are being seen. Prevalence is increasing. How? Why? What's happening?
Yeah. With specific reference to physician suicide, we don't actually know right now if those numbers have increased during the pandemic. We know for sure that suicidal ideation has, that doctors are under a lot more stress. And these surveys that they do, of course, are anonymous. So doctors are much more likely to be honest about what they're experiencing. And so there definitely has been an uptick. But this has been around for a really long time. I remember actually when I spoke in 2009 down in Palm Springs to a group of ophthalmologists from across Canada and shared my story there, that there was someone who spoke up in the audience and said that they had lost some colleagues recently at that time. And that was back in 2009. And so this has been an issue for a really long time. We know that medical students actually, when we start our training, we actually have better mental health than the general population when we start. And physicians as a group, we're very, very resilient people, but you see the mental health start to drop very quickly. Even within the first year of medical school, it starts to get worse and worse. And rates of depression and suicidal ideation and burnout are very, very high, particularly in residency, and then also in physicians. And it's getting harder and harder to be a doctor. And there are so many factors related to that. Obviously, the pandemic has been so hard on physicians just because of the nature of COVID and all that has meant, and all the trauma around it and all the stress. And then, of course, there's all the personal stress that we went through as human beings living through the pandemic. And also, it's being talked about more and more, and I'm really glad to hear this, that we need to figure out, with respect to the regulation of physicians, how we can protect patients, because that's the role of the colleges, but how we can achieve that goal while at the same time protecting the physicians and making it possible for them to get the help they need. Because what we know for sure is that physicians are not getting the mental health supports that they need, and often because of stigma or because of fear of then having to report it to the college and losing their livelihood, and it's everything that goes with that. And I did read in one study that a physician who commits suicide is much less likely to have had any kind of mental health treatment versus someone who commits suicide from the general population. As a population, physicians, we do not get the help that we need, and those barriers need to be removed.
Indeed. It's much harder I find, for a physician to talk about it. Whereas you hear about it a lot more in a general population. Physicians keep it to themselves. They don't want the stigma. They don't want the stereotype to be the one that's not able to cope, whereas everybody else is so intelligent, so performant. It's difficult to be the one that wasn't able to do it.
Yeah, and it's all a facade, right? Because if we look at the numbers, it's like, we're not coping. In fact, it would be unusual to be a doctor and be really mentally healthy. Like, this is a very serious issue, and it has big potential impacts, not only on patients, because I think a doctor who's not getting treated is far more risk to a patient than a doctor who is being treated and is admitting it and taking steps. And also attrition, right? With burnout rates increasing and mental health challenges, there's going to be more and more doctors who just say this just isn't worth it. And so there are so many reasons why, for society, it is absolutely essential that physicians get the care that they need, and that it's safe for them to do so, and that we change the whole culture.
Yeah, even if it is just starting to speak to some close friends or family.
Yes.
And I think also if we had more open discussion as a physician group or physician help, it would be helpful for everyone.
Yeah. And in ways that protect confidentiality. Like, I'm speaking to a group of physicians in Ontario in March, and I heard about that hospital organization having a peer support network, which physicians, it's a peer support group of physicians, and you have the ability to talk to a colleague, and it's completely anonymous. They don't even necessarily know your name. I've also heard about, I think this is more in the States, where they have systems set up where physicians can get help where it's all encrypted and totally anonymous. Of course, that puts physicians in a tough position if then you feel like you have to lie to the college when you come to that question when you're renewing your registration. Like, that's a real problem. And that's something that's actually only emerged in the last few years, that now we get asked this about our entire psychiatric history. And I find when I fill out those applications, I'm relieved that my formal diagnoses were in residency. And so it doesn't matter now, but like how that's a real problem. And we need to figure out how to make the college requirements not be an obstacle to getting care.
What do you tell physicians who fear that they're going to lose their medical license because of a mental health issue or that question that's on the credentialing or the licensure applications? Do you have any advice for them? Should we be ticking that we have a mental health issue? Should we be avoiding it completely? It's so difficult for people to actually, they may be embarrassed or ashamed, or they do not want to admit it. What do you tell them? What is your advice?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I would encourage physicians. I think you could probably, now none of this is advice because I don't know exactly the ins and outs of that, but anytime you can access a situation where you have confidentiality, that's a good place to start. It might even be with it, talking to the CMPA. Say, look, I'm, not feeling the greatest. I want to get some help, but I'm concerned. I don't want to compromise my license. I don't want to lie. Legally, what do you recommend? Because that typically is a protected conversation. Also, one thing I was thinking about peer-to-peer support, even though that has been shown in studies to be effective, a peer is not a mental health expert. So, or someone who's necessarily coached in or has the ability to do techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy. And so a potential workaround, for example, and I hate to even have to talk about workarounds because really what physicians need is proper help. But one thing a person who can do who, say, is suffering from burnout or thinks that they are, is you can hire a coach. And perhaps a coach, there are, psychologists out there who are coaches. There are coaches who have special training in CBT or burnout or trauma even. And so that can be a kind of support where they're not diagnosing you, but you're getting meaningful help. Because for a lot of mental health conditions, if they're not overly serious, like depression, like moderate depression responds really, really well to cognitive behavioral therapy and doesn't even merit medications typically, and doesn't necessarily even need a diagnosis to get that kind of treatment. So that would be one thing. Another thing that I would say potentially as well is you should have your own family physician. Every doctor we should all have our own family physicians that we build relationships with and trust, and to talk to them about it. I have a wonderful doctor, and we talk through all kinds of things. And I don't know, it's really tough. I think really what we have to do is we have to change the system. We have to make it safe for doctors to get the help that they need. And I certainly would, I put my mental health as a priority, but I really feel for those where, they've got a mountain of expenses. They've got children in private schools. They're the sole breadwinner for their family. And it's a really serious thing to put their licenses at risk.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nupra Bakshi, and I listen to the EyeCan podcast.
In the Medscape report that was referred to by Mona earlier, it showed, or it listed the various specialties and the rates of burnouts in each of the specialties. And it showed ER at the very top and public health and preventive medicine at the very bottom in terms of the so lower rates of depression, lower rates of burnout in public health and preventive medicine, and the highest rates of burnout in ER. And ophthalmology was somewhere in the middle. Do you have any? I mean, you were previously training in ER, and you've met with our group a few times, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about why some specialties might have higher burnout rates than others.
Yeah. I don't know that public health is still at the bottom of the list after COVID, if you're in a significant role. But generally speaking, when you look at something like public health, it's more of I wouldn't want to call it necessarily administrative, but and I also don't know the exact duties that are involved. And obviously there's a variety of roles within that, but it tends to be less nights, right? A less intense pace when it's not a pandemic. And also I would imagine that they have less patient contact generally. Like a public health physician is more like organizational planning, that kind of work. Whereas if you think of an ER situation, you're working a lot of nights. I remember I originally, part of the reason I chose it was because I thought it was a lifestyle specialty, because you only had to work so many hours a week, was maybe only 4 shifts a week. Wouldn't that be great? But then I experienced what those nights were like. And also that at the time at the hospitals that I was working at, you didn't get any change with seniority. So you basically were doing that for the rest of your life. And sleep deprivation is very, very hard on the brain. It's terrible for mental health, all the circadian rhythm disruption as well, the shift work, very hard on the brain and mood. And then also there's a lot of trauma. And there was a paper that I saw a while ago, or may have just been an article referencing a paper, but they were saying when they looked at the brains of severely burned out physicians, the MRIs actually showed the same changes that you would see in trauma. And so, especially given what we've all been through with COVID, trauma is playing a big part of what's happening, and it's generally not recognized. I remember in my residency in the first year, in my rota year, I won't get into it because it's not good to talk about traumatic things because you can traumatize the people who are listening. But I witnessed something really horrific and basically had to just walk away from the scene. And I think I could have even gone to bed, but I couldn't. And I was just pacing the halls. And the neurosurgeon who'd been on the case happened to pass me in the hall. And I guess you could see the look on my face. And he said, some nights are rougher than others. And he kept going. But there were no debriefings. We were never taught, how do we cope with this? I got EMDR treatment for some of the symptoms that I was having. I never had full-blown PTSD, but I certainly was getting triggered and had a lot of things that were impacting me. And it wasn't until I went to a MediLegal conference and happened to be sitting at lunch with a trauma psychologist. This was years after my residency. And we got to talking about trauma. And I just offhand said, some things that I witnessed and I still feel like this. And she's like, you need to get that dealt with. And I ended up going and getting specific trauma therapies for the things that I had witnessed. But because I happened to be at a conference at lunch with a trauma psychologist, otherwise I may still have gone untreated. And this is, again, not something that we really talk about much in medicine. And we need to, at the trainee level, be educating people and also giving them permission to, or telling them to get the help that they need, because there is treatment out there that relieves so much of the suffering.
It's so interesting. I think, my experience I'm about to share is different than yours, of course. But I remember witnessing in my first year of residency, witnessing in person my first death of a patient of mine that I'd been taking care of for days. And you're absolutely right about the lack of debrief. I remember it very clearly. I remember the family's reaction, what everyone looked like. And you're right. At the end, it was just, okay, well, let's, sign the certificate of death. I forget what it's called, but, just confirm that this has happened. And then the resident team just said, okay, well, go back to bed and wait for your next page. And there was no debrief about it. And I think, anytime there's a first experience or even if not a first experience, those experiences are always difficult. And I think it's worth any of our colleagues or trainees listening if they go through something like that to make sure that they debrief in some form, because those experiences are very heavy.
Yes, very much. And we know also that debriefing, and that's why I mention it, is that when someone in the line of duty experiences something traumatic, or something either happens to them or a form of secondary trauma where they witness something happening to somebody else, if you can quickly have the opportunity to debrief after, and it doesn't have to be formal, it can be just talking about what happened with a colleague, though you always want to ask them if they're okay with you talking to them about it. That's very important. But we know that significantly decreases the impacts afterward and the development of secondary trauma symptoms and compassion fatigue if we have that opportunity. And I think in other fields, they actually are much more aware of that, and there's much more support baked in Whereas we're the Lone Rangers, where we're just expected to, soldier on. And it's just something about the psychology of medicine that way.
On that point, Susan, do you think that there are personal characteristics that make physicians more vulnerable to mental health challenges compared to non-physicians?
Yes, absolutely. We're so conscientious as doctors, and we're typically such perfectionists, and for good reason, because obviously the consequences of making a mistake can be very, very serious. And medical error is actually one of the things that's tied to suicide risk in physicians. And we typically put so much more pressure on ourselves than anybody else would. And I've coached physicians, and so much of the work that I do with them is around how hard they are on themselves and the expectations that they have on themselves. And we're also taught, our training is so military-like in the sense that we are taught to abandon our most fundamental needs like sleeping and even eating. And we continue on with that often for a whole career, where we're just indoctrinated to put ourselves last and put our families last, to just sacrifice everything on the altar of medicine, which obviously is a very noble thing to do, but it's not sustainable. And I think it has a lot to do with the burnout and the mental health challenges. And so when I work with physicians, we really, really work on healthy boundaries and even managing patient expectations, because I love it when a doctor says to me that, I had a terrible day. This patient wanted this and that, and then this person called and this and that. And I'm like, why are you doing all of that? You don't actually have to do all of that. That is a choice. But a lot of doctors don't feel they have a choice, and they don't realize just how much closer to themselves they can actually draw the boundaries and still be an extremely ethical, very professional, high quality physician and still do a great job.
Do you think there's a difference in burnout rates between women and men physicians?
Yes, I've seen the data, and definitely higher in women.
How do you explain that?
Oh, well, I haven't seen an evidence-based list on exactly why that is, but I can certainly make some informed guesses. Women, we're socialized more to be even more self-sacrificing and so other-oriented, caretakers. So I find that it's the female physicians typically that I have to work much harder with in drawing those boundaries and giving themselves permission to take care of themselves. And also, of course, for so many women, there's the second shift, right? So not only are they pouring themselves out all day long in their clinical practice, but then they go home and it all starts all over again. And there's also often lots of boundary issues in their personal lives as well. So we typically will work on both. And it's a beautiful thing to see women start to let go of the guilt and start to really embrace that the better that they take care of themselves, the better they're going to be able to perform as physicians and show up for their patients, the less errors they're going to make, the sharper they're going to be, and also the better they'll show up for their families and friends and communities. So everybody wins when physicians take care of themselves.
And Susan, as you talk about that, because I think I really, connect with that idea, which is, take care of yourself and you'll be better for others. But obviously this is a struggle for many of the people you work with. And how do you get to that aha moment where the people you're talking to get that? Is it by repeating and repeating and repeating, or are there, visuals or metaphors that you give them that help them have that aha moment? What's your experience been so far where you've been able to, I'm going to use the word convert somebody from not understanding that to getting it and wanting to do it?
Yeah. I love cognitive behavioral therapy. So I really, really use those techniques in my coaching work. And so much of it is getting at the whys, like WHY', and beliefs underneath, because so many of these beliefs that we have as physicians for why we make our choices or for why we can't take care of ourselves, they're automatic. They're programmed. many of them don't even stop to think about where that even came from or whether it actually even makes sense. And so when I say to a physician, so why do you feel that you had to do that? Did you actually have to? And then we start digging into that. And it's like, why do you think that it's not okay for you to go to the washroom during your shift? And often they'll actually start to see the absurdity of some of the choices. And then also we'll do experiments. Like I had a physician that I was working with who was just always going overtime with their patients. And so a lot of the work as well. And I want to mention too, the onus is not on the physician. So much has to change in the system of medicine itself. That is a primary driver of burnout. The physician themselves, we are not the drivers of burnout. We are not the problem, but we do make it harder for ourselves. So that's where this is coming from. And so I had a client who was just constantly going overtime and running late and not getting billings done and not getting chart notes done and using their weekend to catch up on all that paperwork. And the appointments were supposed to be 20 minutes. And so we just did an experiment where that doctor for a week at the beginning of every patient appointment would say, okay, so we've only got 20 minutes. And so I'm going to have to be done at this point, just so that we have that in mind. And they expected all this pushback from their patients. They thought, oh, this is going to be a battle. This is going to be really hard at first. And they were stunned to find that they were still actually in their old habit of just going overtime. And the patients would start saying, doctor, it's 11:20. And it was amazing to find out that the patients actually weren't these huge time suckers necessarily, that a lot of it actually was the doctor themselves. And then now they were getting help from their patients to be on time. And now they're still continuing to stick to that 20 minutes. And then they've got an extra 10 for charting and billing, and everything feels different. And that's just one little experiment that completely changed their medical practice. And they learned so much from it too, about even the goodwill of the patients. So it can be those little changes that can change how your whole practice feels.
It's incredible. And it's true, it does take a lot of our time practice, but also we never take time for ourselves. Of course, if you're going through a burnout or not feeling too well, and it's important to stop, I guess, and say, I need to take the time for myself.
Oh, yes. And it can be in simple ways. Like I would often teeter on the edge of burnout in my clinical practice. I would notice, because one of the symptoms is cynicism and negativity and depersonalization. And so I would start really resenting the patients and not really wanting to see them, and just feel so stressed by the crowd in the waiting room. And when I started to feel like that, one of the things that I would do if that was starting to slip is I would make sure that I was eating. I would make sure that I had a really good breakfast. I would make sure that I was hydrating. I would make sure that I was taking little breaks instead of just pushing. And even something as small as the way that you pace yourself through your day and making sure to eat, exercising if you can, trying to get a little bit more sleep, that can very quickly change your energy levels and how your brain is even functioning. So there's lots of small things that we can do.
What do you think can be done within the medical system to reduce stigma and help promote physician mental health? We talked about this a little bit, but I think if you think of other systematic issues that we haven't touched on yet, is there anything you think we can all do as a group to reduce the stigma?
I would love to see more physicians coming forward and sharing their stories. And one of the things, at least I know on the college renewals that I fill out, they ask you, have you been diagnosed with a mental health issue, and are you currently at risk of being a risk of harm to patients? And so those of us like myself who that really serious mental health history is more in the past, it's safer to come forward. And so people sharing their stories is really big. Also, checking in with our colleagues. We know that a sense of belonging, a lack of a sense of belonging, is a direct suicide risk. It's one of the 3 big factors that are tied to it. And there's studies that show that just having a colleague sincerely ask you, hey, how are you doing? How are things at home? How was your day? What was rough about today? Is there anything that you want to get off your shoulders from patients today, or anything like that? We know that when a colleague just simply checks in on a colleague, the person who's getting checked in on has a greatly enhanced sense of belonging. And that is so important to our overall resilience, our mental health, and even suicide prevention. So that's something small that we could do. But what I would love to see systemically is we know that physician burnout is a major issue and that physician mental health issues. There was a thing that I saw from the CMA that was in global news. It was pretty recent, I think. I think it's maybe summer of 2022, was saying that actually on a survey of 4,000 physicians, that half of them had depression, half. And so if it's this rampant, we need to start having supports in place, whether it's formal systems that are really easy to access through hospitals or through whatever, where physicians can get access to anonymous counseling, where we're even looking, I don't know, like mandating breaks. I know physicians don't like being controlled, and that's also stressful, but if we can figure out ways to bake into the system things that intentionally support mental health, that actually make it much, much easier for physicians to take advantage, because we're terrible for that, right? We're terrible at taking care of ourselves. And we have to find ways to support physicians that physicians will actually use.
Is there a way to encourage them to use these support systems? Because a lot of times it's also the physician on themselves. They're not ready to take that step and actually help.
Yeah, I would love to see incentives. Again, I want to be careful about forcing people to do things, but I would love it if there could be bonuses for doctors who are working with a coach or seeing a counselor, like maybe even that doctors would see counselors, whether or not they have a diagnosis, whether that just be part of the job, and to make it really, really accessible. Like maybe it's virtual, maybe it's just a 15-minute check-in, but maybe if for every time that they check in with a counselor just to talk about how things are going, that they get some kind of bonus, and that it's not, the ones who have mental illness who are doing it, but rather that everybody would have that access and maybe get some kind of a reward to incentivize it. I don't know. That's just a thought.
What about a CME credit like section, right? We've got section 1, 2, 3, and we can have a section W, section wellness, where you have a minimum number of credits a year. I'm just thinking out loud here. Let's talk to the Royal College tomorrow.
Category C credits.
Yeah.
That would be great.
I am happy that I'm hearing more about this, with colleagues. Both Mona and I work in academic centers. So, she's surrounded by learners. Most days she's at work as I am. And I definitely hear this, it's more top of mind than it was when I was training, and that wasn't too long ago. And so that's wonderful news and great progress. I think even for my colleagues, faculty, I hear them talking about it more. I hear them talking about it more with the learners as well. So I really do hope that we'll be in a better place in the future. I think of myself, things that I never said before that I now say, when sometimes I don't have time to take a lunch break, to be frank, which is not great, but I don't. But I'll always, close the door for 10, 15 minutes. And if I have learners with me, which I often do, I'll say, I need, a 10 to 15 minute mental break. I never said that before. I would just escape somewhere and hide in a room for 10 minutes and have peace and quiet. And now I'll just say that because I think, I realize that I'm modeling to those around me. And so, I will use those words more often than I ever did before. I'll ask, if people are doing exercise or, what they did for fun on the weekend or what they have plans for outside of, catching up on reading and research projects and so on. So I hope that this is, becoming more of a conversation. It is my observation, at least in my environment. So I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction.
So I know you're a flamenco dancer. Did it come about because of this? Was this one way to let out stress?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, when I took that stress leave that Karen advised me to take in residency, I spontaneously took a trip to Cuba by myself, and I saw people dancing salsa on stage. And I remembered that as a little girl, I had wanted to be a solid gold dancer. Don't look it up. But Karen had sent me on this mission to rediscover myself. And that was one of the first clues that I got. So when I got home and resigned from my residency, I signed up for salsa dance lessons and did that very seriously for a number of years. And then switched over to Spanish flamenco. And it was so, so healing, not only because of the exercise, but because of the music and the community and the creativity. It awoke something that had really died during my medical training, really my humanity, actually. So that was a big, big part of the healing.
Wow, impressive. Nice. So as we close each episode of the podcast, we'd like to ask our guests about activities outside of their professional work. What keeps you centered? Any good books to share with us? Any hobbies besides flamenco dancing?
And I'm not doing that very much anymore. It's very hard with the speaking schedule that I have. I can't take classes like I used to, which is too bad. But I have replaced it with lots and lots of walking. I walk every day. That's probably my biggest mental health anchor. And I also, during the pandemic, actually got into Nordic skiing. So that's a huge, huge passion of mine. And I love reading books. And actually for 2023, one of my main intentions is to get back to reading good old fashioned books and try to do that every night. And one that I'm reading right now, which is super interesting, is Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. He's a journalist, and it's very much about how our brains have been changed by phones and technology and how to reclaim our brains and reclaim our humanity and the good things of life before the phones took over. And so I'm finding that really, really eye-opening and inspiring in making me rethink just a lot of the patterns that I've gotten into.
So those are your top activities that keep you well. Outside of your personal preferences, do you have like a top 5 list as you're working with, your patients on mental health anchors or activities you encourage them to explore more than they did before, whether it's family time or exercise or eating, or do you have like a top 5?
Yes, I actually wrote a whole book on that. Like my book, The Resilient Life, is very much about what those anchors are. So top 5, I would say sleep, number 1, because if you're not getting enough sleep, everything is worse, everything. So that's the first one to target if you're not getting enough. And then there's so much evidence for the power of exercise on the brain and on mental health. So I would say number 2, studies have shown that it's even as effective for moderate depression as our best antidepressants. If you're just doing cardio 3 times a week, it's so powerful. Nutrition also makes a huge difference. There's more and more information. I've been talking about it for decades, but there's this burgeoning field called nutritional psychiatry. And so what you eat makes a huge difference to mood. And well, that's debatable how huge it is, but we know that it does. And also affects the brain's ability to cope with stress and processing and all of that. And also I'm constantly taking courses at the Benson Henry Institute for Mind Body Medicine at Harvard. And the evidence there is just incredible for mind body medicine practices and inducing the parasympathetic nervous system in different ways that are lasting to help mitigate stress and protect our bodies from stress, and also elevate mood and decrease emotional activity, all of that. And how many is that? That's 4. And then for sure, we know that relationships, like positive relationships, they're actually the biggest determinant, according to long-term research, of our health and happiness is our relationships. So that's something that's so important to make time for and put energy in, and to save yourself for, to make sure that there's room in your life for those people who are most important to you. It's very, very good for your mental health. So
sleep, exercise, nutrition, and positive relationships.
Yeah, and mind body. Mind body was 4.
And mind body.
Yeah.
Amazing, Susan. That was so interesting, and you took this topic and shared so much of what you've learned over the years, and given us specific advice and hope. So, thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
Season 3 of the EyeCan podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. Thank you for your support.
Thank you to the Canadian Ophthalmological Society.
The EyeCan podcast is written and directed by Kim Teitler and produced by John Allaire from Allaire Strategic Works.